is community, and that all of us in here would find one way or another to be connected, that when you come into this place, you'd have a sense of belonging and connection, and that even if you're visiting, that you would feel welcome, that you'd feel like a guest, and that maybe it'd be something that would even swell something in your heart to say, you know, I'd love to belong to that group. And of course, we also know that being able to deepen that is important, that you can have a chance to connect and deepen those relationships even outside of this room with people that you have in this room and have church with. And so one of the things you hear us talking about often are things like connect groups and ABFs. And there's one ABF we've been talking about for the last few weeks and about launching it. And I'm very excited to say that today is the day that we are launching the single parent ABF. And so this is going to be an exciting time, and if you're a single parent and you're considering some of this, this is maybe a great opportunity for you to explore this ABF. And to help kind of explore that ABF, one of the leaders of the ABF, Casey Wilson, is going to come and join me here for a moment. Casey's going to be helping to lead this, and so Casey, thank you for being willing to come out here and just talk to you for a bit. And you're like a natural at this. She really is. But, just thinking about this ABF and what it means and knowing that you're a single parent, what's the hardest part of being a single parent in today's world?
Phew, where do I start? There are many challenges, and some of ours are different. I think the one we all have in common is it's a balancing act. It's tough. You have to make sure everyone's taken care of and you get to where you need to go.
Kids are not easy to balance.
Sometimes no.
At all. What's the most rewarding part for you in just being a parent?
I think the most rewarding part of being a single parent is you are your children's role model. It's a tough job to do. You know that you're responsible. I'm solely responsible for leading my children to Christ. And at the end of the day, you can give yourself a big hand because you did a two-person job all on your own.
Yes, you can. I was just thinking about that, and we were talking backstage just a little bit, and just thinking about what single parents really do face in today's world. And I'm really excited about just hearing you talk. I am so excited about the launch of this ABF. And just want to give you a chance, though. Like, what are you looking forward to most with this ABF?
Well, it's like you said, a sense of community. We're really looking forward to being there for each other spiritually, as support. Being a single parent can sometimes be a lonely job, and we just want you all to know you don't have to do it alone. Let's come together.
So, we're going to launch this, and we do this from time to time where we actually take some time out in the middle of the service to do something like this. We're going to have like an extended greeting time here in a moment, but during that time, we're going to have some other leaders from this ABF. Casey is going to be right over here with some of our other leaders. There's Glenn right over there. And we're going to take 2 minutes, and we're going to greet each other and just kind of let you just mill around and stuff. But the main reason for doing that is if you're interested in this group, I would love for you to be able to just have a chance to talk with Glenn or Casey, ask some questions. In fact, you're going to actually take them over. They can actually look at the room and visit with some other people. So why don't we all stand up, and during this greeting time, good morning. Good morning. Great to see you all here. I'm excited about that ABF. That's going to be a fantastic ABF. Well, I'm going to be finishing up our series here on the feast. It's all about remember, discover, and celebrate. And to do that, I want to start off just with a quick illustration here. From years ago, there was a woman who came to me and just hated her job. She was it really was a bad situation. She was really praying, asked me to pray for a better job. And suddenly this one job came along, and she's like, pray for this job. I'm interviewing for it. And so we prayed for it, and I prayed for her. It was kind of a long interview process. And as she got deeper into the interview process, she realized there were really some candidates that were far more qualified than she was, but she was kind of still in the running. And I remember one Sunday when she just said, I feel like God has said, I'm going to get this job. I'm going to get this job. And I'm like really excited. I'm like, let's, pray. So did. And it really looked like she was going to get this job. Came down to kind of the final meeting, and they had kind of hinted at like, you've got this job. She gets to the final meeting, and sure enough, technically she had gotten the job. But the company had decided to eliminate that position. And it's just this, I know, it's this heartbreaking thing. And you're just like, okay, God, like, I didn't know I needed to pray, help her get the job and have the company keep the position, like, what's going on here? And sometimes we pray about stuff, and it's stuff that's really important, or we feel like God is saying something, directing us to something, and then, like, it doesn't happen the way we think it was going to happen, or sometimes we feel like we have this sense of what God's doing, and then it's something different, and it can rattle us a little bit. Or when you think about praying for something, sometimes I know I feel this at times. Like, I'll be praying for something, or I know somebody will be praying for something that is simple, and not that we shouldn't pray for it, but like, God, just help me get through the crazy rush hour traffic, or God, just help me with some little thing. Have you ever had a moment where you feel like God is answering the prayers of rush hour traffic or simple things, but then somehow doesn't answer the prayers of a serious illness, or someone who doesn't even have a job, would love to have to put up with rush hour traffic just to have a job? And, there's that thought that goes through your mind, is God just tackling, the easy stuff, and the daunting stuff he, just doesn't want him to get around to? Well, obviously not. But the question comes back to, what do we do when we face those moments where it's just like, God, it doesn't feel like we're in this, or I'm getting kind of confusing signals from what it means to follow? Well, here's what I want to offer to you. I think that oftentimes we face those confusing moments in our spiritual journeys. I think it's a part of what every follower of Christ will have to face and deal with. But I also believe there's this great hope that we have and that we carry. And that is oftentimes when we are at some place or juncture in life where God isn't making sense. Those are often moments where God is inviting us into a larger kind of space, where he is doing something deeper or more profound than what we can see with just kind of the limited perspective that we have. And it's not that our perspective is bad. In fact, I think it's okay to actually pray to God and say, God, you got to know, from my perspective, here's what I see, here's what I believe, here's what I pray for. It's just so often God invites us into a kind of faith that isn't always easy. But it's also a great opportunity to sit in a place with a deeper perspective with what God is actually doing. And that's what I want to talk about here this morning as we look at these different feasts. And I'm going to look at this one feast in particular. It would have been the third in the string of 3 feasts that we've been kind of walking through. It's known as the Feast of Booths. Now, to get at the Feast of Booths, though, I want to give some background to this. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12. Because there's really some background you need to have to really understand the passion and the emotion and the things that would be going on with this feast. And it all has to do with this sense of longing, this deep sense of longing that all the Jewish people would have held all through the time that the Old Testament is being written and well into our world here. And so the background is this, Genesis chapter 12, look at verse 1, and this is part of the story of Abraham. It says this, the Lord said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land that I will show you. Now, of course, this becomes this kind of great beginning of this relationship that God establishes with a guy by the name of Abram. We know him most often as Abraham. And what happens in this moment is really remarkable. Abram is living somewhere in the land of Mesopotamia, a place called Ur, and God comes to him and initiates this relationship with him and says, I want to start this new life with you. And part of what I'm going to ask you to do is pull up all your roots of what you would call home, and you're going to have a new home. And he leads him to this land that we would know as the land of Canaan, the land of Canaan. And you realize for all the Israelites, the land of Canaan became something remarkably important. In fact, the land of Canaan becomes home in every sense of the word to Abraham. In fact, he changes his name from Abram to Abraham. And the land of Canaan, which would then become known as the Promised Land. Think about that name, the Promised Land. Because that land came as a promise in this relationship that he had. This became home. And for all the Israelites, the Promised Land would capture this sense and notion of what home is all about. Home to them in the Promised Land represented life itself. It represented relationship with God. And you know, the truth is, we all understand what it is to have this sense of home. We all know what it is to have experienced homesickness at one time or another. We all have that sense, this deeper sense of what home is, deeper than just what a house is. How many of you maybe grew up in some place outside of the state of Arizona? You grew up in some place far, okay? And how many of you, after you left that home that you grew up in, ever went back and visited it? You know, drove, and think, man, like more than half of you. Why do we do that? Like, my old home over on Abington Road, right here in Tucson, every once in a while, and not very often, but every once in a while, I just drive by it, I just look at that, like, why are we drawn to go back and look at that home, right? Well, because there's something deep about it, more than just sentimental. It's almost like there's a part of us that is there. We want to go back and see it or visit or think about it because it has a kind of essence to it. You know, home is more than just having a place that belongs to you. Home is more than just there's a piece of property, a structure that belongs to you that you sleep in at night. In fact, in some ways, you belong to your home more than it belongs to you because you have roots there. There's something deep about it. You know, there's something about home when we think about the essence of home. It establishes something about who we are and whose we are. And you think about the Promised Land, man, for Abram, it was all about discovering who he was, who God had made him to be. But it was also about whose he was. He now was a friend of God, a child of God. It's like he belonged to God. And you know what? We all need a spiritual, because that's what Abraham found in the Promised Land. There's a great statement that is found throughout the Old Testament in a number of different spots that kind of captures the essence of this. God would sometimes look at the Israelite people and he would say to them, you will be my people, and I will be your God. Isn't that gorgeous? Like, there's a part of you that's going to belong to me. I'll be your God, or you'll be my people, and you'll belong to me. But there's also this tender part where God says, and I'll be your God. I'll kind of belong to you as well. That's home. And we long for home. Abram longed for that home, and he found it. What's interesting is that a couple of generations later, his descendants end up losing the Promised Land. They lose the home because this famine drives them out. In fact, his great-grandson Joseph ends up living in Egypt and becomes powerful and wealthy and is able to rescue all of his brothers and his dad and their families and just the whole clan. Is able to rescue them and pull them into Egypt. And in Egypt, they find wealth, they find popularity, they're strong, they have all these wonderful things going on. But what's interesting with Joseph is even when he is in the land of great prosperity, in the midst of this regional famine that was wreaking havoc all over the world, he makes an interesting request. He says to his children and his descendants, he says, someday I'm going to die, and when I die, I want you to embalm my body, and I want you to save my bones. And I know that someday God is going to take you back to the promised land. And I want you to take my bones and bury them in the promised land. Even Joseph, who found such blessing and wealth and just a good life in Egypt, it wasn't home, was it? For him, home was to go back to the land that was promised to his great-grandfather by God himself. That was home. I want you to bury me back there. And of course, 430 some years later, all goes bad for the Israelites. They become this huge population of people, this nation of millions of people, but now they're in bondage and they're in slavery. God brings along Moses, who's going to rescue them. And what is his primary job? It is to rescue them and deliver them where? Into the promised land. It's to take them home. It's also interesting, you can read this in Exodus, that Moses actually makes sure they have the bones of Joseph to take into the promised land, to bury Joseph there. And part of what we see in the story of Exodus, it is a story of homecoming. It is all about this great desire that they had to go home, to be where they belonged, where they would know who they were and whose they were. Saved. So now we come to the Feast of Booths, where its initial entry into the history of Israel comes at this point of right after they're rescued out of Egypt, but now they're in the wilderness area. And at some point in the wilderness area, God begins to give Moses instructions about this festival, this feast that they are to celebrate called the Feast of Booths. And so I want us to look and just see how this is described. So if you would, flip over your Bibles to Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus chapter 23. But as we read this, don't just think of it as just kind of this dry instruction. This, again, is all about what it means to be a part of this homecoming, to come home. So, Leviticus chapter 23, we're going to start in verse 41. And this is where God begins giving him instructions on this. Verse 41. God says this, celebrate this as a festival to the Lord for 7 days. So this whole thing, this feast would last for 7 days. And people would pilgrimage from all over to the tabernacle or to Jerusalem for this. The Lord for 7 days each year. This is to be a lasting ordinance for generations to come. Celebrate it in the 7th month. Live, and here's what they were to do, and that's why it's called the Festival of Booths. Live in booths for 7 days. All native-born Israelites are to live in booths, so your descendants will know that I had the Israelites live in booths when I brought them out of Egypt. And so kind of what happened with this whole thing is that whenever they would celebrate this, and again, they would celebrate this around the tabernacle before they had the temple, and then when they built the temple in Jerusalem, they would pilgrimage from all over to wherever the temple was, and they would have this big 7-day celebration. And you've got to picture this. They're coming and they're going to live in these booths, these little shelters. It's kind of like a makeshift hut is maybe the best way to describe this. And they do this, they build these huts, and then, they kind of all come together, and everyone's living outside in these little bitty huts. What does that remind you of? Camping. Yeah, it's like God has said, I want you to go camping for 7 days. That's what this celebration is going to be. And for some of you, when you think of camping, you're just like, oh, wow, it's wonderful, right? How many of you love to go camping? Yeah, a bunch of you. How many of you would just go, oh, this would be like, this is not a celebration. This is just like a trial of endurance. How many of you? Yeah, your idea of camping is the Hilton. Yeah, and do we have enough money to get room service while we're at the Hilton? That would be your idea of camping. Camping, the wonderful thing about camping is that nothing ever goes completely right. Completely ever, right? There's always something that goes wrong. Years and years ago, I was camping with one of my very good friends who I've gone camping with him multiple times for years and years and years. We still go camping together. His name is Darren. He's actually on staff here. And one time, Darren and I took a friend of ours, Jay, on a camping trip. And I was going to make my world-famous camping soup. And it's this soup that I learned how to make from this guy on a camping trip I was at in New Mexico. And you get all these fresh vegetables and you chop them up, and there's all these special spices that you put into it. You cook the soup, and then you take ground beef, because ground beef you can freeze it. It's a little easier to haul if you're hiking or whatever. And then you cook up all this ground beef, and then when you get the vegetables done, you put it all together. It's got all this water so that it helps you rehydrate. It's really good tasting. So I was going to make this soup. Well, we get there, and I chop up all the vegetables, and I put it in this big pot of boiling water, and I get ready to put all the spices in, and realize my thing of spices I left back home. I had no spices at all. I didn't even have salt or pepper, okay? Nothing. And as fate would have it, I ended up, and not because I was trying to be healthy or anything, I just, grabbed the first, pound of hamburger off the shelf at the grocery store. Happened to be like the super lean, the leanest hamburger you can buy or whatever. It had like no fat in it, and just, so now I've got all this meat, and the stuff that has all the good flavor in it isn't in there. And so I grill up all the hamburger meat, and I put it into the vegetables that have been boiling. And there's not one spice in this, right? I would have put a pine cone in this if I thought it would have made it taste better, all right? So there's three of us, and I scoop up our soup, and I kid you not, it was just clear water, okay? With chunks of green beans and corn floating around with a few chunks of hamburger in it. And they looked at it, and it's just like, yeah, it's just hot water with a very tasteless piece of vegetable in it. And we ate that. And it was so disappointing. You've heard that saying, any food tastes good when you're camping. Well, not really. That's mostly true, but not completely true. And camping always just has moments like that where you're just like, something's gone wrong, and it just kind of changes your perspective. I keep things of salt and pepper in my truck now at all times, just in case, all right? I'm always prepared to salt my food, no matter what. A couple of weeks later, the guy Jay that went with us on that camping trip, he came up to me and he played this really goes, Glenn, you're not going to believe that. You know that soup that you make in camping that's so good? I go, yeah. He goes, someone has actually got some recipe close to yours. They're going to market and sell that soup. You can get it at the grocery store now. I'm like, what, really? He goes, yeah, it's called Dasani. So that's camping, right? And so it's kind of interesting that what God has them do here through this is He wants them to go camping. That's what He wants them to do. He wants them, they're going to have to set up their little campsite, and they're going to get out their lanterns, and they're going to their torches, and their little camp stoves, or whatever their camping gear was. Coleman might not have been around, 3,000 years ago, but they pull all that together, and they're going to camp, and they're going to live in these little makeshift huts, okay? And they're going to spend 7 days doing that. And remember, all of these feasts have a remembering, a discovering, and celebrating component to them. And this whole thing of going out and camping has this really strong remembering component to it. Because the remembering part, they would be in a very concrete way living out in remembrance what their ancestors literally had to do when they fled from Egypt on this great homecoming track to go to the promised land. They would have remembered when they were first building these little structures, these little shelters that they lived in. Now, here's what I find that's so interesting about what God does in this. He has them building these structures, and what's interesting here is He doesn't have them celebrate or remember what it was when they entered into the promised land. You think about this huge thing. For centuries, the Jews had waited for this homecoming to get back to the promised land. You would think that a festival that would last 7 days, where they would pilgrimage from all over to come and celebrate it, would be celebrating and remembering the day that they first took their first steps into their home, the promised land. But that's not what God has in celebrating. In fact, it's actually kind of the opposite. What they're really celebrating here is their first step into the wilderness. Now, think about that for a moment. For hundreds of years, for sure when they entered into bondage and slavery, when the pharaohs changed out and the pharaoh that didn't like them so much went into power and made them slaves, you've got to believe that their prayers were, God, take us home. I don't like this, take us home. Their prayers were, God, get us home, get us home. They pray for that. And what's their first answer? The wilderness. And you know, when they were in the wilderness, things were not fun, were they? In fact, to this day, the traditional name for the Feast of Booths, as the Jewish people still practice this, is the Hebrew word Sukkot. Sukkot. And Sukkot has kind of this double meaning. It carries the meaning of like a shelter, which is kind of obvious that they would build all these booths. But Sukkot also comes from the name of the very first place they camped, called Sukkoth. Sukkoth was the first place they came to. When they fled out of Egypt, they came, and their first campsite, where they first built those huts, was in a place called Sukkoth. And Sukkoth wasn't a real fun place. You know, Moses took them on a less than desirable route. You know, the route they could have been in 3 to 6 weeks. They could have been in the Promised Land. Instead, they kind of head south by southeast, and suddenly they come and camp, and to one side, they have Pharaoh, who is growing very, very angry. He is pulling together his armies. He's wanting to come after them at this point. But what they have to the west of them is the Red Sea. They are trapped in this place where they have fled. They really don't have enough provisions. They don't know what they're doing. They're not prepared to fight all these enemies. They are stuck in this place called Sukkoth, and life isn't good. And God says, I want you to celebrate this. They were praying for the Promised Land, and they got something wildly different. See? And here's the point I want to make. We all know what it is to pray for the Promised Land and end up getting the wilderness. We've all prayed for that job. We've all prayed for someone who is ill or sick. We've all prayed for something to work out that mattered. And not little things, things that really do matter, good things. And what we thought God would do, what we thought had to be the desire of God, ends up being something different. And instead of the Promised Land, we end up with the wilderness. And those are the moments that are so hard, that can be so difficult. And God says, I want you to celebrate the thing you might not expect me to have you celebrate. And I think there's a reason he does this. And this is where we get to kind of the discovery part of this. Sometimes the greatest discoveries we make aren't when things all go well or God answers our prayers the way we want. Sometimes we discover the deepest truths when things get hard or go a different way. So I want you to picture what happens here in this moment. Were the Jews homeless when they left Egypt? Well, no. They weren't, right? In fact, the point that God is making is, I want you to remember that they had shelters. But understand this too. The shelters that they lived in, these little huts, they were representative of something deeper than just God provided them a shelter. God was providing them something much richer than just a shelter. You know, when you think about that home you grew up in, and maybe and I know not everyone has great memories of the home that they grew up in, but when you think about home, what made that home you grew up in, the home that you love, and you think about, sometimes you smell something or see something and it reminds you of home. You know what it's not? What made your home the home wasn't the brick and wood. It wasn't the brick and mortar that made that home the home. What gives you all of those great memories are the memories of the relationships. It's the memories of the things that happened then. It's the memories of how you grew up there and who you became and how you discovered who you were and whose you were. It is the memories and the relationships that make it a home. See? Relationships make a home. And you know how God ends this section? He goes through this thing and he describes for them what they're to do with the Feast of Booths. And then he ends it on this. Look back at Leviticus 23. Look at the very end of verse 43. It ends with this. And he makes this one relational statement. I am the Lord your God. I set up shelters, I done stuff, but I am the Lord your God. And what he's saying is, you have me. You have me. See, they weren't homeless out in the wilderness, but they weren't homeless because they had shelters, because they had little huts. The reason they weren't homeless out in the wilderness is because they had me. Home really isn't about the location. Home is all about the relationships. Home isn't the dirt. The thing that made the promised land their home wasn't the dirt itself. You know what made it their home? It's because that was the place that God established this incredible faith-based relationship with Abraham. The reason the promised land was home was because that was the place that Abraham stepped out in faith. That is the place that God looked at Abraham and said, Abraham, you're mine. I have counted unto you righteousness because of my grace, because of my promise, not because of anything you do. And it is this amazing relationship that he establishes with God, and it all gets lived out in that place. That is what makes the promised land home. It's because of God. The thing that made your home a home growing up, or made it a place that you dreaded that wasn't a home that you should have had, was because of the relationships that were or were not there. Houses will come and go, but home is something that gets rooted into our hearts with one another and with God. You know, it's interesting. The Israelites lost the promised land. They got it back. They lost it. They got it. They've lost it. They got it back. But ultimately, home was never really dependent on the dirt or the land itself. And I get it. Maybe some of you grew up in a home, and it was terrible. And maybe it was something that left you feeling homeless spiritually. And now maybe you even walk into a place like this, and there's this deep longing for a deeper sense of who you are. But the place you find that is with God. Home. What they learn in the Feast of Booths is that home is with God, not in the promised land. The reason they could celebrate their first step in the wilderness is because God was in the wilderness with them. Home is with God. And if you're at some place where you're hurting and you're just saying, man, I long for that sense of who I am. Who am I in God? What's my name? The place you find that first and only is in God, because home is with God. And you know, I know that so often we have these moments where we'll struggle, because you may even come to the place where you just say, okay, I get it, Glenn. I get that home is with God. I get that connection with God is that place that you find purpose or meaning or a sense of fulfillment. But if you knew my life is so far gone. I am so far from God. I'll never find home. But you know, there's this other great lesson that we get out of this, because the truth is, you have hope too. And I realize some of you may have come into this room here this morning and you're feeling like, man, I am so far gone, and it is because doubt is overwhelming you. Doubt about God, maybe God's existence, maybe about doubt about God's love, or maybe there's some deep failure in you. There's that secret that you hold and you just say, I failed in some way, and I just, in the core of my being, I just don't even feel like I have a place to even come and pray. I just don't even think God would want to hear my prayers. Or maybe you've been hit with a kind of depression that has just left you feeling and thinking, I am spiritually bankrupt and homeless. And what do you do with that? You know, if that's you, what you face is what everyone is faced. What every person who's ever followed God has had to face those moments at one time or another. And what I love about the Feast of Booths is there's something about it that is meant to give us a perspective, even in those moments, that gives us a sense of hope towards something else. You know, the first discovery is that home is with God, but there's another discovery that is equally as important that I want to point to here for just a moment. And it comes really out of this tradition that followed the Feast of Booths for as far back as I could study this, and just going back to the oldest manuscripts and things that you can look at. There was this practice on how they actually built the booths themselves that points to something really beautiful that I want you to get here. If you look in Leviticus chapter 23 sometime, I think it's like verse 40, God describes how he wants them to build this with the materials. And what he says is, I want you to build this out of branches from these luxurious, beautiful trees. And you're going to cut off these big branches with all these pretty leaves and stuff on it. And you realize if you start building a booth with just these branches in this way that you would lay up there, it will look really, really pretty, but it won't protect you from the elements. In fact, the whole tradition behind building these booths was that you built them with these branches in such a way that if you're standing inside them and were to look up, you could see more sky than what you would see in terms of branches. It won't protect you from the rain. It won't protect you from the wind. In fact, the whole point was that you would be exposed to seeing, feeling, and observing all of nature out there. So you're camping and you go in to sleep in your little tent at night. Only it's not much of a tent, okay? The whole practice of this feast is not to have like some really good outfitter tent that can withstand storms and snow and rain. This is, you can see and are exposed to everything. But I want you to get what this does, because this does something spiritually to our perspective. And the reality is, I want you to experience this. So we've worked on a little experience. I want to walk you through here in the next moment. I want you to picture that we are all in a little festival of Sukkot ourselves, okay? We've been camping all together here for several days, celebrating this feast. And evening rolls around, and as evening would roll around, everyone would start their campfires. They would break out their Jewish Coleman lanterns, like this one right here, and they would light them. And you can imagine what it would be like, right? That as evening comes, and the fireplace is there, and everyone would be talking and sharing stories. But as the night would go on, suddenly your perspective is drawn out, and you begin hearing the sounds of the night, right? If you go camping, you know what this is like, and suddenly you become aware of the things that are beyond just the little circle that you're in, beyond just what you can see in that moment. And then as the night would go on and it would be time to go to bed, people would start stoking down the fires. They might start turning down their lanterns. They would crawl into their little booths and lay down. And as they would look up, and they could see through the ceiling of these little huts all the stars of the sky. And suddenly, the perspective that they would have would be of the entire universe. To lay in one of those huts and to look up and to see the stars that God spoke and flung into existence. You begin to feel what it is, that there is a God that is everywhere. That this God that they worship isn't just in this little desert, in this little wilderness. He is everywhere. He is throughout the entire universe. And if the Israelites could carry that sense of what it is to be serving a God who fills the expanse of the universe, to be able to get up the next morning and walk out of their hut and say, the God we worship is a God that is as far out as the distant star and is as close as I am. Suddenly you begin to carry this sense that we serve a God that is everywhere, which means there is no place so far that God isn't there still. And that becomes the important discovery. To be able to have this tangible experience that there is no place, I look at this universe, there is no place that God isn't there still. There is no place in this wilderness. There is no place so far in the desert of Sinai that God isn't there still. There is no place where there is an enemy that is so strong that God isn't stronger still. There is no place that may seem so barren, so desolate, that God isn't there still with nourishment or water or whatever we need. And if the Israelites could hang on to this sense that home is with God, but that also there is no place that God isn't still, then suddenly these two discoveries come together as this thing of hope that they could hang on to. And that becomes the thing that they can now celebrate. No matter what they face in the wilderness, that would be the thing that they would need to take into the promised land. And friends, that is the thing that you must take with you. In those moments that you pray for that thing and it seems so good, but you pray for the promised land and the answer is the wilderness, the thing that you hang on to, is that home isn't with a particular answer to prayer. Home is the fact that you have a God that you can pray to. And no matter what you face, it is not so far away that God isn't there still. You, friends, have done nothing so bad, so awful, that in some weird way that you've run so far away from God that God isn't there still. God's grace and God's love, I promise you, is farther than you have ever run in your life. There is no stupid thing you have ever done that God can't overcome. There is no bad thing. There is no injury. There is no pain. There is no hurt that has driven you so far or in a pit so deep that God is not deeper still. That is the thing that you can hang on to. Home is with God. And there is no place so far away that God isn't there still. You hang on to that in whatever you face. And I want you to think about this in the sense of who we are as a church, what it means for the church to come and gather together. You think about what that meant for the Israelites to pilgrimage together, to spend 7 days together, and to celebrate this and say, as a people, we gather because we have our home collectively as a community, and our home is with God. And friends, we have the same thing as a church. We're not going to be the church that holds up in fear. We don't gather together because we're afraid of the world out there or we're hiding from something out there. We're not the church that gathers together and just has to come up with simple, trite answers to just, pretend like everything's going on inside of us or that everything's going well inside of us. That's not the church that we have to be. We can be this church that says no matter what's going on outside there, we get to be a church that celebrates that our God is big enough, that we worship a God who can handle whatever it is that we face outside of these walls. We are a church that says we are also a spiritual home because of the God that we have, that anyone who walks in through these doors and into this room, we want them to experience what it is to have a relationship with God in the most authentic way. That you can walk in these doors and you can have doubts of all kinds. You can have your life in whatever spot it's in, but you can come into this place and begin to discover what God is really all about. We will be a church that says no matter how far you feel from God, there is hope for you. We will be the church that when we gather together, we get to say, and we get to say this, not just me up here saying, we get to say it in the way we sing with one voice. We get to say it in the way we greet one another. We get to say it with how we treat each other with love and grace and forgiveness and grace. We get to say these things to everyone who is a part of this. We say it to one another, and we say it to those people who come in as our guests. We get to say that no matter what you have or haven't done, you are never a lost cause. I love the idea that because of the way you live your life, that when someone walks in this door and they worry that they will never get a second chance at life, that they come in here and the thing that they will feel is that they are not a lost cause. Just hearing part of a story this morning from what someone shared with me, that they kind of walked into this room the very first time someone invited them, compelled them to come into this place, and maybe in a little bit of a way, they kind of felt like a lost cause. But what they experienced in every way, shape, and form was that this church says, no, you are not a lost cause. And we say that as a church. We live that out in what we do in community and in this worship service. We get to say every week that no matter what the chaos is going on in your life, no matter what's going on in your family, or what fears there are, or how it may be torn apart, or what scary things you face, your life can be made new because there is a God that is with you. And when you walk into this place, you will be reminded of God's love and God's grace, and we celebrate that. We will be the church that gathers, and through the love and grace of God, with one voice, we declare home is with God, and there is no place so far that God isn't there still. That is what we declare in just being a community. So when you walk out of here today, you remember that and celebrate that you have a spiritual home. Now, before I close, I want to just say a couple of things. To those of you who are maybe visiting here for the very first time, what a pleasure it is to have you here as a guest. And maybe you're here and man, things are going good. We're glad you're here and hope you get to celebrate like crazy. Maybe you're here and your life's getting turned upside down and you'd love to have someone pray for you. You know, we have a prayer ministry room right over here, and anybody on any Sunday can walk into that place and know that there are wonderful, loving people that are a part of this church that would love to pray for you, just as a Christian brother or sister. And maybe you need that this morning. Or maybe you're new and you just say, man, I'd love to connect and just know a little bit more about this church. Maybe meet some of the pastors or key volunteers around here. Well, if that's the case, I'd like to invite you to what we call the 10-minute party. And that's going to be right back in the connection room. And you can just walk right back there at the end of this service. And if you're new here, in fact, I'd love to meet you. If you invited someone and they came for the first time, feel free to invite them to come back there and meet myself and some of the other pastors on staff here this morning. Why don't you